Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My next guest is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, retired US Army Colonel. We've spoken previously about many matters relating to Ukraine and a world at war in all but name. He issued his own State of the Union address earlier this week. Let's have a look.
Americans, I am Colonel Douglas Macgregor, combat veteran and former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Trump. As Chief Executive Officer of Our Country, Our Choice, I want to respectfully present an alternative view of the State of the Union. The Constitution, our nation's guiding light, mandates that the government promote the general welfare, a charge that obligates Washington to secure the basic necessities of life: energy, food, and shelter. Regrettably, the current administration is failing to perform these tasks.
Colonel Macgregor joins me now, I hope. Good to see you there, Colonel Macgregor.
Good to see you, Neil.
What inspired your own State of the Union address? Had you heard Biden's offering by the time you spoke?
I had read Biden's offering. I had not heard him deliver it. And once I read it, and also read what President Trump had submitted, I decided it was time for a different approach, because I don't think either of the presentations really touched on the things that are important to the American people.
Mr. Biden's headline statement was about continuing to fight Putin. How much further does that enterprise have to go?
Well, I don't think it's got very much further to go, Neil. We've run out of resources. It's prohibitively expensive for us. We're adding $1 trillion to our national sovereign debt every 100 days. We're at $34 trillion. That means within the next month or so, we'll be up to $35 trillion. It's unsustainable. And anyone who tells you that debt doesn't matter hasn't looked at the historical record. It very much matters. The other thing is that the American people are completely disinterested in this war. They're not interested in fighting anybody. They're much more concerned about our open borders, this massive invasion from the south, rising criminality in our cities, the lack of rule of law, which we were famous for hundreds of years. These are the things that they're concerned about. They want an end to the inflation. They want us to bring our financial house in order. So I don't think Biden, or for that matter, President Trump, really addressed those issues.
Colonel, I've spoken to various voices about the possibility that America is being invaded from the south. Brett Weinstein, Michael Yon. Do you see that as an accurate description? Is there some kind of undeclared invasion of the United States of America unfolding as we speak?
Yes, there is. It's very strange, because when you dig down into the organizations and the associations that are actually promoting the massive influx of millions of people from largely the developing world and China, you discover that most of the money to support and sustain it is coming through non-governmental organizations that are funded by the United States and the United Nations. So it's absolutely preordained and orchestrated by those entities. Our government in the United States has been weaponized against us.
What are the American people saying? You know, we here on this side of the Atlantic, you know, we get precious little coverage of the scale of what's unfolding on the southern border. And we certainly we're not invited to get an impression of what the people, the electorate, those contemplating their vote in the upcoming elections, we don't hear those voices. What is the atmosphere in the States about this issue?
Well, today Americans are saying that every state is increasingly a border state, because there's been a systematic effort to deposit hundreds of thousands of these so-called migrants, these illegal migrants, in all of the states. This is part of a plan to try and bring in people that can eventually be given citizenship and will vote for the status quo. That means the people in Washington are ruling us now, expect these people to support them in perpetuity. It's not working. Americans are furious because people at the state and local levels are running out of money. These people are being given free health care, free transportation, free shelter, free food, free everything, checks, thousands of dollars in cash. The New York City mayor is talking about giving everyone a $10,000 card of prepaid value. I mean, this is insane. Americans are fighting to put food on the table. They're trying to maintain their families. People are working 2 jobs, and these millions are walking in and being paid handsomely for their trouble. None of them are interested in becoming Americans. They don't know anything about that. They're here for everything that's free. And people know it, and they're angry. But to get to your critical point, the media doesn't really allow this to reach the body of the population. In other words, the discontent inside our country is not widely felt or understood because it doesn't reach the rest of the world, let alone our own government in Washington.
Tom Buick, it's almost surreal, I would say, to watch what's happening on the southern border. You know, on the one hand, no one denies that there are 10 million people perhaps have crossed, and that number may be higher. And yet, there doesn't seem to be any active response by those agencies and by the government that might be able to intervene. It just seems to be, it's like watching some sort of slow motion remaking of the United States of America, of the Republic, before our eyes, with no one doing anything to counter it.
I mean, it is surreal. You're right on that point, Neil. And it's also, I think, surreal, the fact that tens of thousands of people risk their lives to come through the Darien Gap. And then there are often buses waiting for these migrants to bus them up to the American southern border. So the way I look at this, notwithstanding obviously the heated issue around irregular migration, which in my view is only ever going to be solved whether it's here in Europe and what's going on across the Channel or what's going on through the Darien Gap by international agreements on migration. I'll make that point. But secondly, I think what's really important is that we dial down, I think, some of the rhetoric here around the position that these migrants find themselves in. Why are they coming through the Darien Gap? What are they fleeing? Poverty, in some cases war and destitution. Yes, many of them are economic migrants for sure. But America was founded on this ideal. I mean, I've visited Ellis Island in New York Harbour, where 8 million migrants from Europe and elsewhere were processed within the space of just 12 months. So I think we've got to get this into some kind of historical perspective. But I do think also, Neil, there's a failure of statecraft here, because the answer to a lot of this irregular migration is around countries getting together. I mean, those South American countries, which I'm assuming the US has diplomatic relations to a lot of those South American countries, where is statecraft in all this?
How do you react, Colonel, to what my guest in the studio has to say there, Tom Buick? Where is the statecraft? And is he right to invoke a history, say, Ellis Island, America being, as we all know, a nation founded upon and founded by a migrant population? How do you react?
Island did not found the United States. We existed from the early 1600s forward. Ellis Island was a temporary measure to deal with the influx of European immigrants that industry needed. We need to go back and understand that between 1815 and 1924, only 34 million Europeans came to the United States. Now look at that time span. If you go back over the last 30 years, we're talking about 50 to 60 million people arriving. It's impossible to assimilate, impossible to track, to understand. We actually built a public school system in the early part of this century in order to give education, but also to teach citizenship to millions of people who'd come in the years previous. It's a very different situation today. So these people, in many cases, are young men. We've had at least 20 to 30,000 young men from China showing up. There are actually camps in Darien exclusively for Chinese, exclusively for people from Latin America, exclusively for people from Africa. This is very well organized and orchestrated. None of these people are vetted. No one is asking anything about them. The objective is to push as many of them into our country as possible to change us demographically, to denationalize us, to dilute our culture and our identity. That's what this is about. And this is not going to work. And it's almost impossible for me to imagine a future where there is not significant violence as a result of this, given our fragile financial position.
Colonel, it seems to me that the goal is wide open for a politician who would turn again to the working people of America and consider their aspirations, their needs, their wants, their anxieties, that there's a wave there that might be ridden to victory by anyone with the compassion to address what they want.
Well, that presupposes two things. First of all, something you brought up earlier about election integrity. We've had problems throughout our history from time to time with elections that were rigged or where there was substantial cheating, and we dealt with those things in the past. Today, it's very different. Today, we have the problem of automation and computers and online, a number of different voting methods that are very hard to track and control. This is by design, frankly. You've got people in Washington that want to stay there. They're in charge right now, particularly this Biden regime and the people in their cabinet. They are trying with all of their might to stay where they are. So it's very hard for us to deal with election integrity. We're trying. We've got people that are going to be out watching the polls, but that's a very difficult process. And I would argue that the other side has thousands and thousands of attorneys on the payroll of billionaires who are there to give an advantage to Biden and to the crowd that is currently governing us, not to the opposition. So that's part of the problem. The other thing is that if your democratic process is questionable, the notion that you can go out and hold a clean election and win it to the point where you can sweep in and take power is an illusion. And if you look at the money, the billionaire oligarchs are putting their money behind this invasion, behind the left, behind the people who are governing. This is an anti-American government by design. We know it, the American people know it, and they're bewildered as to how to fight back against it. So they will go to the polls, they will treat it seriously and try to make the best of a bad situation. But if this thing turns south, if it turns nasty, and they begin to conclude, accurately I suspect, that things have been rigged against them, I don't think that we're going to have peaceful, stable, easygoing times ahead of us. I think things will get very...
Hold that thought, please, Colonel. An anti-American government by design, so much more to talk about, but we're on another commercial break, after which, more important debate with Colonel Macgregor and Tom Buick. What is the future for democracy in the West? You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back to The Neil Oliver Show, where I am still with academic and commentator Tom Buick and US Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel, this war in Ukraine that goes on and on, is there something else? Is there some other reason for the preoccupation of this administration with that war? Is there something else that's yet to come to light for the general public to explain the determination to prosecute that war?
Yes, I think there is. But before I say anything, I just wanted to tell you to pass on my congratulations to George Galloway. I'm sure he'll be a breath of fresh air in Parliament. I think there are a number of forces at work right now inside Ukraine. We cultivated this war over decades. This is something that the globalist elites inside the United States, sometimes we call them neocons, whatever you like, were building in the hopes of ultimately goading the Russians into doing exactly what they did. You've already heard about the various biolabs that were established inside Ukraine, which were conducting very sinister operations that were directed at Russia. We now have public knowledge about the numbers of CIA stations inside Ukraine that were directing violence and hostility towards Russia. This obsession with Russia really begins, I think, at the point in time when it became clear that Russia was recovering. Once Mr. Putin took over, went after the oligarchs, was trying to bring order to chaos, I think at that point there was a decision that we can't allow this to happen. We don't want Russia to recover as a great power. And you have a number of people with financial interests, people that were trying to find a way to destroy the Russian government, strip Russia of its resources, exploit its weakness, and render Russia essentially a poor satellite of the United States and NATO. All of that, of course, has failed miserably. And in the process, they were billing all of this as a way to hold NATO together. Remember, ever since 1992, NATO has been looking for a reason to exist. It was very clear when I reached NATO in the late 1990s that in the absence of the Soviet Union, there was no real justification for the old alliance. So they had to find reasons, and those reasons started in the Balkans with a series of interventions there. And then there was the slogan, NATO is either out of area or out of business. In other words, it has to march into other people's countries around the world, shoulder to shoulder with us, where it has no purpose. You have to wrap all of these things together and then look at the activities of people like Larry Fink, who's the chairman of BlackRock, and the billions of dollars that are about to be spent to buy up vast tracts of Ukrainian farmland that can then be repurposed and exploited by Fink and his friends and the agricultural conglomerates in the United States. There's a lot going on, and this happens whenever you see a country utterly and completely destroyed. And that is the case with Ukraine. Ukraine as a nation is destroyed.
Tom, when you listen to the Colonel, and you said earlier that that war started when Putin sent military across the border. When you listen to the Colonel, what do you think? Isn't it the case that it's a much more complicated story and that NATO and the West were the provocateurs there?
Wars are always very complicated. You go back through history. We made a decision in this country in 1939 when Churchill became Prime Minister, the head of a national government, not to accept appeasement. I mean, as Churchill said at the time, you cannot compromise with a tiger when your head is between his jaws. Where I agree with the Colonel is that obviously there is a degree of complicity here of the West more generally, but certainly in terms of the US and UK, when we think about the fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the dying embers of the old Soviet Union, that the West, the UK was a signatory, and Russia guaranteed Ukraine's sovereign borders. In 2014, when Putin sent troops into Crimea, annexed Crimea, what did countries like Germany, the Netherlands and France do? They signed the Nord Stream 2 deal with him to get cheap energy into Europe. So I agree with the Colonel in terms of the complicity, but the issue right now, and back to the Churchillian statement, is you cannot appease a dictator. Putin is a dictator, and that's why he needs to be repelled.
Colonel, while I still have you, I listened to your State of the Union address, and unlike the sitting president, I thought that you identified and sought to address profound problems that the Republic faces. Given the opportunity, would you throw your hat in the ring? Would you take up a political role to directly affect the destiny of your country?
Well, frankly, that's an impossibility. You have to understand the structure of power in the United States and the distribution of wealth, and that's simply an impossibility. It's not something one does a few months ahead of an election in this country. And the parties are absolutely united in that they do not want fundamental change that will disrupt the flow of cash to their various donors and friends and supporters. We refer to Washington, D.C. as donor-occupied. In other words, the billionaire oligarchs in the United States control Washington. There is no real democracy in the United States. That's what most people are discovering. Democracy is a sham. We used to have representative government where the people in Washington actually were accountable to the people that elected. They aren't anymore.
I have to jump in there, Colonel. I can only say that I, for one, would like to see you having much more of a direct influence over the destiny of the land of the free. But thank you so much for joining us so far, and we will speak again.